Hello, everyone. This is Shane.
And this is Stan.
We wanted to make a brief statement ahead of today's show. Unfortunately, Dave's out of town. He couldn't participate in recording this week's episode or this statement with us, but he joins us in our message. And that is the host of the Dive Down want to make our beliefs very clear to you, and that is that we believe Black Lives Matter. In the intro of the show, you're going to hear me make a pretty vague statement regarding the current events that are taking place in the United States and around the world. I think I just wanted to say something that didn't offend anyone, and by doing that, it served no one, I think. After the fact, I and we realized that we aren't really concerned if we offend anyone who is not aligned with our beliefs on these matters.
Yeah, we share the commitment of many of our listeners, hopefully all of our listeners, in educating ourselves on the unfathomable pain faced by people of color in the United States and beyond. All proceeds from this week's episode will go to Black Lives Matter Global Network and several other organizations that fight for justice on behalf of oppressed people and communities. We encourage our friends and listeners to support marginalized communities when and where you can, and we have included some resources that you too can consider in the fight to end institutional racism and support justice for oppressed communities all around us.
Thank you for listening to this. Thank you for listening to this episode, and thank you for continuing to be a listener of the Dive Down.
Hello and welcome to episode 76 of The Dive Down, a Magic the Gathering podcast for the casual spike, focused on the latest decks, trends, and strategies in Modern and Pioneer. My name is Cavedan here in New Haven, Connecticut, and with me on the line from Denver, Colorado, it's the one and only Shane Beeps.
Cavedan, it's good to see you again, my friend. You know, every week I look forward to these conversations we can have about Magic. It takes my mind off of what's going on around me in the world. It gives me something to look forward to and just, you know, chill out with my bud Cavedan, my weekly conversational partner.
Absolutely. This is like family dinner night, practically. How have you been all week? I haven't seen you since, what was it, last Monday?
Okay, full disclosure, it's been a tough week. We record on Mondays. Our podcast comes out on Friday. I'm hopeful that this week improves. I'm hopeful that all our listeners out there are seeing some more positivity in their lives, that they're hearing positive news, that they're experiencing positive things, and if not, that things are trending towards the direction that you all want. I think that, you know, full disclosure, it's been tough, I think, for all of us, and it's kind of a little bit selfish feeling for me to, you know, jump on a podcast and try to talk only about Magic. And I know that the audience doesn't want to, you know, some of the audience probably is like, you know, just stick to Magic, and of course we're going to stick to Magic here. But I think fundamentally that it makes sense for everyone to pay attention to the world around them and try to get as much information as possible through reputable news sources, and try to enact change if you believe that change should take place. And so I think that that's been in the back of my mind. I am glad to be taking a little break from that with you all, talk about positivity in Magic, have some enjoyable conversation with you all. And I hope that listeners out there can enjoy it this week.
Hear, hear.
Yeah, very well said. So I want to circle back to that, but before we do have a special guest, a frequent guest of the pod that I would like to welcome, also joining us this week from Chicago, Illinois. It is Stanislav.
What's up?
What's up?
Dan, you were the best hire we ever made all those years ago. You started as an intern. Now you're running the show. Frankly, you've learned a lot. You've grown a lot. At first, I didn't think you had it in you, but now here you are. You're my boss.
It's weird.
It's so weird, but I'm grateful. And also second everything that Shane said. And listen, if you need someone to chat about like the world outside and some of the things that are stressing you out, listeners, you can always reach out to us. You know how to do that. You can pick our brains. We're here for you. Cavedan, thank you for joining us this week. You're the host of a really excellent podcast. I sometimes almost think of it as a sister podcast because I know we share a lot of listeners. We share some patrons. You're from Faithless Brewing.
Yeah, very much so. I think we are the younger sibling of the Dive Down.
Only a little bit. You were hot on our heels.
Well, I mean, I don't know if this is the right time to say this, but you guys are the reason that we started Faithless Brewing. So
Get out of town.
You're like, hey, there's a space in this modern podcast world for us to exist. I'm glad we could have a small amount of inspiration for you all. But you've really taken it in your own direction, and that's always been awesome, right? Is like, the concepts are similar, getting better at magic, focusing on enjoying magic and learning from each other and the audience and just trying to be I think a positive force for the modern and pioneer communities.
yeah, thank you for saying so. I think it also shares a theme of like magic with friends. I'm fortunate enough to have two of my very best friends, Damon and David, who are my co-hosts on Faithless Brewing. And I think that's kind of what makes the whole thing like feel sustainable and really just like a big part of just the rhythm of my magic life.
Rhythm of my magic life. Rhythm of my magic life. That's one of my favorite club singles.
I don't know that song. Cavedan, as long as you're buttering our bread, can I say, and I mean this truly from the bottom of my heart, you have one of my favorite voices in magic. I feel like I could listen to you talk about anything and enjoy it. And if you and Dave Harbinger, our other co-host who is out this week, but we'll be back next week, if the two of you spun off and made your own podcast, I would scream. I would be like a teen at a Beatles concert.
So with all that being said, we're giving you all of the speaking roles in tonight's podcast. We're going to sit back and just sort of guide you with complex hand signals.
That's amazing to hear. I mean, because you two sound exactly like you sound on the podcast, talking to you right now through our little video conferencing call.
I would hope so, because that's the microphones we use.
Which is always a shock, because I can't stand the sound of my own voice, so it's always weird to listen back to an episode.
That's enough pleasantries for one intro. On this week's episode, we are breaking down Monday's B&R announcement and react to the new companion rules that were introduced by Wizards of the Coast. Then we dive into all the things that we love about Magic and try to look ahead towards some of the products, games, and decks on the horizon. Finally, we wind down with some listener questions submitted by the Dive Down Nation for our guest, Cavedan. But first, some housekeeping.
All right. Housekeeping this week goes over to me. So with full control, I will thank our new patron in Ross. Thanks very much for your support. And of course, thanks very much to our newer, older, long-term citizens of the Dive Down Nation. We honestly would not be keeping doing this without your support. So thanks again. Increased tiers. We have Blue Cheese, in one of our extremely long time citizens of the nation. Thank you for moving up a tier, Blue Cheese. And also thanks to Purple Plat for their review on Apple Podcasts. We appreciate that feedback. It makes us feel good about ourselves. It helps people find us on the internets. So thank you. If you're interested in what the Dive Down Nation is, it is our Patreon. You can find us at patreon.com/thedivedown. And what that does is allow you to give us a little bit of your hard-earned money because you like what we're doing, and it helps us keep going. You can do $1 an episode. You can do a crazy amount of $15 an episode because you really, really like us. And some people do that, which I find mind-blowing. There are different benefits at different tiers. You can get things like tokens, stickers, pins, play mats. What am I thinking? Am I forgetting anything? Oh, at the highest tier, you can request an episode topic and work with us to create a custom episode of your design every 6 months. And those are honestly super fun to do. You heard one recently from Jacob when we talked about advantage in Magic, how to know if you're winning in Magic and what to do and how to reclaim advantage in Magic.
I love that episode, by the way. Fantastic episode.
Yeah, and that was a blast to do. And those are benefits that we get from you all being citizens and benefits you all can get from being citizens. So head over to patreon.com/thedivedown if you are interested.
Did you mention the Slack on that?
Oh yeah. The Slack is one of the best reasons to be a citizen of the nation, because there's always good conversation going on. Of course, we had some good B&R conversation today. There's always people designing new decks, talking about changes in the meta, talking about their favorite Dark Souls game. What they're playing on Switch, what they're watching on Hulu. So there's off topic and on topic convo, and it's definitely one of my favorite parts of having a Patreon is having the community around it.
Yeah, one of the things that I've really loved about Slack are all the community Magic tournaments that people have been organizing, especially right now during this era of quarantine and isolation. And one of the ways that you can play Magic online and play with any card pretty much ever is with Mana Traders, because they let you rent cards for your Magic Online account. And then you can use them to play Modern, Pioneer, Standard if you're nasty. I think you can play Commander. And listen, you can use a Mana Traders account while supporting the Dive Down if you sign up with coupon code The Dive Down, all one word. You get 15% off your first 3 months of service. Help support the show while playing Magic. It's win-win.
Yeah, absolutely. I love Mana Traders. It has transformed the way that I experience just Magic as a whole. And I'm glad you mentioned the Slack. If you had not pitched it, I would have pitched it myself, because this is jumping the gun somewhat into the topic of this theme of the show. But just in terms of like, what is Magic as a hobby? It's a lot of time that we spend thinking about the game, whether that's listening to podcasts, talking with your friends. People who don't play Magic that much sometimes ask me, "Oh, you must play a lot of Magic games." And actually, that's such a small part of it. But it's actually little community spaces. Places where you can sort of have like a little community, a little family. And that's what the Dive Down Nation Slack is, actually. It's just a wonderful place to just connect with people on something that everyone's very passionate about together.
It's true. We've made some real friends from like all over the world. There are people who I talk to about their cats and children in Norway and beyond. It's really cool.
Stan, I'm gonna punt this over to you now for the breakdown.
Yeah, so breakdown, news desk, Dateline, The World, June 1st, 2020. A new banned and restricted announcement was published today, featuring both bans in Standard and suspensions in Historic, which we will not talk
AKA
about
bans
at all. I think they've unsuspended cards, if I've been paying attention, I think.
It's the free bans that don't get you wild cards.
Yeah.
The sneaky bans.
But perhaps more importantly to us, the announcement formally changed the ruling of the companion mechanic. And Dan, I'm not sure if you know this, but whenever we get a new B&R, one of the things that we like to do, if it pertains to some of the formats and topics we talk about on the Dive Down, is we'll actually read some of the language and some excerpts from the article and reflect on it at large and piece by piece.
Great.
So
I love interpreting text and picking apart sentences very closely, especially when they come from corporations.
All right, so Ian Duke's article today states that starting June 4th, the companion mechanic rule now reads, once per game, any time that you could cast a sorcery, so during your main phase when the stack is empty, you can pay 3 generic mana to put your companion from your sideboard into your hand. This is a special action, not an activated ability, which means it does not use the stack. And this happens immediately and cannot be responded to. It cannot be countered or stopped by cards like Phyrexian Revoker.
Or even Nimble Obstructionist.
It can't be nimbly obstructed, cannot be stifled.
All right, initial thoughts on this, Dan.
Yeah, so I spent a good chunk of my week last week just trying to sort through all the different possibilities for what might happen. And it seemed like, broadly speaking, there were 2 directions that things could have gone. One was that there would be some kind of blanket ban to the effect of, the companion mechanic no longer functions in constructed tournaments or something like that.
Like it's just a card in your deck type thing.
Right. Basically strip away that ability from competitive one-on-one. Now, the other direction was to somehow tweak one of the knobs. And it looks like that's the direction they went. So Magic, as we know, is a game of many, many resources, whether that's the mana cost of a card. People talk about starting with different numbers of cards in your hand. You could tweak the power, toughness, the lines of text on a card. And even the companions themselves were using this new resource of your deck construction and even a sideboard slot, if you consider that a cost. So this is really interesting that they chose this path, saying, okay, we're not going to take the cards away. We're not going to ban them. We're just going to try to tweak the knobs a little bit so to make it more of a fair exchange. Would you guys agree with that assessment?
Totally. I mean, what once was free now is not. It used to cost no mana, now it costs 3 mana.
Yeah, it's just, I mean, it's like a tax, basically, right? It's just sort of a blanket tax. And it's interesting to me that you mentioned, Stan, it's like a non-stack action. And so in that way, it can really just function as an increased cost. Like Dan, you mentioned they could tweak a variety of knobs, and the one they chose was just mana cost. And so you're not, I mean, depending on how you want to play it, if you want to play it as is, just for 3 mana more, you can, because your opponent doesn't gain priority. They can't use something like a Colligan's command to make you discard it, for instance, once you put it in your hand. Like if you immediately have the mana, like if you have 6, you pay 3 to get Lurrus in your hand, you can immediately pay 3 and get Lurrus back out because your opponent doesn't get any kind of priority back. So really, if you look at it as just a mana increase, that's all it can be. It also allows, we'll talk about this later, I'm sure, but it does allow for some sequencing changes that does then open up the opportunity for the opponent to interact with your hand in some fashion, which then also does offer kind of further ideas of, cost versus benefit analysis and opportunity costs and analyzing what could be in your opponent's hand and so on.
All right, moving on. Let's look at some of these excerpts.
Cool, Shane. Let's go. It's already 18 minutes.
Shane, I disagree wholeheartedly, but I'm just going to look at some excerpts from this article. All right, Ian writes, we're introducing a change to the companion mechanic that is motivated by game balance and metagame share across play environments. Our reason for making this change is based on metagame data and play rates of companion decks across all formats, and on player feedback on repetitive gameplay patterns. As a group, decks using companions have too high of win rates and metagame share in Standard, Pioneer, and Modern, and have already necessitated bans in Legacy and Vintage. This trend represents a long-term problem for the health and diversity of all formats. Rather than go down the path of making several individual adjustments to the banned list of each format, we feel the better solution is to reduce the advantage gained by using a companion across the board.
Yeah, that's a paragraph. Repetitive gameplay patterns, check. Yes, and sort of a yes and no, right? Like it's repetitive in terms of we can expect certain cards at certain times, or perhaps certain cards at certain board states, more than just like a curve. But we have been seeing a lot of the decks sort of shifting around and changing shape and changing construction while still employing the most powerful companions most often. So yeah, I'd say that there are repetitive times in which you can expect a companion to be used, but I'm not sure that the gameplay patterns are fundamentally the same from game to game.
I disagree. I think that this is the biggest thing that was frustrating about companions. So when we're talking about learning what an archetype does, you think of the play pattern, classic Jund, they're planning to play a Liliana on turn 3, and that's central to their plan. But then when you're actually sitting down against a Jund player, they don't always have Liliana on turn 3, and that's part of what makes the game so dynamic and interesting, is seeing it play out different ways.
Sure.
These Lurrus and Urian decks, they're going to play the Lurrus and Urian pretty much on their schedule. It happens every game. And so the gameplay is interesting, interactive, and there's ways you can strategize around that. But just the fact that it's guaranteed to happen.
Yeah, that's frustrating. Mm-hmm. It's interesting too, Dan, that you have added a third way of saying Yorian to this podcast. Stan leans towards sort of like a scoop out. Stan leans towards like a Urian, and I'm a Yorian man, and you're a Urian man.
I am. I suppose I am.
A Uri man.
What about too high win rates and metagame share? Does that line up with some of your experiences playing with or against these decks? Like, were you obviously favored if you're running a companion deck against your average non-companion deck?
Yeah. I wish that were not the case, but my experience says yes. And they've cited the magic number of 55% in there.
Yep. Once you get to high 50s, you are screwed unless the metagame can respond to you. And if you've been listening to our pod, you know that companions are a heavy player in Modern and even heavier players in Pioneer. So they have a big metagame share.
Yeah, I do think this is good news for people who loved Mishra's Bauble, because there was a while where I think we may have even mentioned it on the show where it felt like maybe they were going to try to ban Bauble for Luris's sins, quote unquote, and clearly they're trying to avoid that, right? Rather than maybe punish specific cards that are good and synergistic with these companions, they'd rather try to tweak the knob of this rule, as Dan put it.
And I hope it works. I mean, one outcome is that this is similar to the Bridge from Below ban in multiple ways, but in what I'm thinking is that it could be similar in the sense that this might not be enough of a nerf. I think Urian especially is still very, very dangerous. I can talk about why later, but the alternative reading is that, yeah, they didn't ban an innocent card like Bauble. Bridge from Below deserves a second chance in Modern or something like that. I don't know. I don't have any strong feelings about that.
All right, the article continues. The result we intend is to reduce the metagame share of companion decks while still capturing the spirit of the mechanic's design and still having companions be worth building around in many cases. So this, I think, is really their goal in an outline, right? They want to both balance the format while keeping these cards and as many of the surrounding cards playable. But I do think that worth building around in many cases is a little ambitious from a competitive perspective, right?
Yeah, like what do they mean exactly, right? Like worth building around by who in one environment? What do you think, Dan?
Oh, I'm not selling my Urians or Lurises just yet. I think these are very much still cards to be reckoned with. Let me pose a hypothetical question to you. Suppose they'd announced this change and said that it costs 2 mana to put your companion into your hand. Would you be so confident that the companions were dead? Probably not, right?
Well, who said they were dead? Not me.
Yeah, 2 and 3 is a big. Every mana counts, and especially in the formats that we talk about on the pod. But yeah, 2 is definitely more appetizing than 3. Sure.
Okay, right. But how big a difference is that? And are you willing to go with that extra mana for your companion? I think a lot of decks will say yes, we are, and that might narrow the range of decks that want to use them to either big mana decks or decks that just don't need to play them until very late in the game. But some of the strongest companions that we've seen, Urian, Luris, they're already well equipped to play a long game. There are control decks that play those. They'd be happy to pay the 3 mana tax. I think I heard a really interesting podcast episode last week about the card Fires of Invention and Pioneer. I don't know if you guys
I heard that one. It was pretty good. It was okay. Yeah, it's interesting. Yeah, I mean, if you have fires out, it's not like you're doing anything else with your 3 mana.
True. And I think in the case of Luris, it basically turns your 3-drop into a 4-drop, in a lot of games. And maybe that's going to be the new repetitive gameplay that we kind of have to get used to.
Well, I mean, that's a huge tempo disadvantage, right? Where you're saying like turn 3, I'm going to put Luris in my hand, then turn 4, I'm going to deploy it. I mean, that's a lot to ask, I think.
Guess you got to hold up that force of negation.
Yeah, I mean, what's interesting is like capturing the spirit of the mechanic's design is inherently false because the mechanic's design, all the cards are designed around the mechanic. And so now they're changing the mechanic fundamentally. And so therefore the spirit that they intended in the design of the cards is fundamentally changed for every one of them. Mm-hmm. And I think like Dan mentioned, and I think we'll talk about this in a little bit, is like some of them are going to weather that storm more strongly than others.
I've been trying to interpret that one sentence, the spirit of the mechanic's design, and I can't quite pin down what they mean, but I think they mean that it is still a bonus card. And I know when a lot of people were trying to analyze what made companions so good, it was the idea that you get a free card, and a lot of the proposed fixes that I heard were, oh, well, you should take the free card away and make you start with 6 cards or something. Mm-hmm. And now having seen the change that they did go with, I think I'm actually pretty happy they didn't go with that route because some of these companions are actually worth many, many cards. And it's hard to balance just on a card-for-card exchange. So in that sense, even though the mana tax might be initially unappealing for the Eternal formats, which are so much about efficiency, in terms of just like giving you a bonus, a free card if you've gone through the hoop of the deck building construction, that part is retained. Although it's a little sad that the early game companions, like you said, are hurt much more by this.
Yeah, I kind of think the next clause sort of speaks to that a little bit. The article goes on to say, we expect that this new version of the companion mechanic will result in a deck building challenge and means of self-expression that some players can opt into rather than being a huge part of the competitive metagame. And I think this is them kind of like revealing what their goal is for these cards moving forward and maybe Magic in general. But, prior to this rule change, it kind of felt to me like your deck more or less had to run these mascots to compete. But now they're really framing it as more of a means of self-expression. And Dan, you're the brewer of the three of us right now. Do you think that companion restrictions offer enough room to design in a way that is self-expressive without being forced to run the most efficient tools that, have like proven synergies with companion, such as like Bobble or Seal of Fire with Luris or Astrolabe with Urion?
I do think that they allow for exactly that. I have always been of the school of thought that restrictions will breed creativity. Actually, the companion spells out a very specific restriction, but any card, even if it's not a companion, if you're trying to build a deck around it, it has restrictions on it. You just have to figure out what those are. And having efficient tools to work with a restriction is not inherently a problem. I mean, you mentioned Seal of Fire. What's wrong with Seal of Fire? That's actually a clever solution the first time someone thought of it. And, once the puzzle has been solved, it gets less interesting. And I think that's what happened so quickly with companions, that it became sort of, everyone got tired of seeing these. But actually the innovation was happening all the time. A very innovative 1 month in Modern's history, I think.
Yeah, my thinking on this is like, are they really going to allow real means of self-expression that players can opt into? I think they're taking some air out of the tires of companions in general, right? And that's kind of a pretty boring way, but I think a necessary way if you're going to change an entire rule set around a mechanic. They're reducing the overall power level down to I guess you could mess with that if you really wanted to type thing, besides maybe some of the uber powerful ones that we already know are uber powerful. And so I think they're going to accomplish their goal, which is that it's not going to be a huge part of the competitive metagame. A huge part. I think it'll still be a part. And maybe, like Dan was sort of inferring earlier, maybe Urion's still busted. Maybe Luris is still busted, and we'll have to wait and see.
And maybe that's okay if they are, right? Like, cards can be busted and still be fair and within the power level that we find acceptable for the formats that we play. But Ian's article goes on to say, by charging additional mana, playing a companion becomes less efficient relative to playing the other cards the player has drawn. I found that sentence so interesting and thought-provoking, but I'm going to go on. In this way, players are more likely to cast their other spells before their companion, resulting in more divergent game paths. Next, the additional mana will often slow the companions down by a turn, allowing the opponent to interact with it while in the companion player's hand, or otherwise giving the opponent an additional turn to plan ahead before the companion hits the battlefield. So, more insights on their intentions and how they expect games to play out moving forward with the companion rule if it stays as it is now. Anyone want to react here or think they may be even overlooking something in how the rule change might impact companions and deck building moving forward?
Well, that first sentence that you read there about, let me try that again. Well, that first sentence that you read there about the companion being a less efficient play, and so you end up playing it last, I think that is a true statement of what the new play pattern is going to be, but that makes me think of what Shane was saying about that is not necessarily an inherently desirable play pattern. I don't know why that's a better way to play companions. And that's probably not in the spirit of what they were thinking when they designed some of these companions. So I think that, it's going to just change the way that these cards are used. And it's a little bit unfortunate that you're now forced to basically forced to play it as your last card in hand. But
I feel like some decks are already in that situation too, though. Like, I've been messing around with that red-white equipment deck in Modern, where it doesn't run Bauble, it doesn't run Seal of Fire. It's kind of like Infect, but with equipments and core creatures. And Luris is in the sideboard as a way to make your creatures a little bit more recursive, but like the plan of that deck isn't to get to Luris on turn 3. The plan of that deck is to, play your whole hand, and if you haven't won by then maybe cast the Luris and try to get back some creatures that your opponents might be interacting with. And like in certain decks, I think that could be a totally reasonable game plan, and maybe reduces some of the feel bads of like dealing with really interactive strategies that, might thwart your plan going into game 1.
I think we need to have a quick chat about Urian or Urian. Urian?
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 I don't even remember how I say it now. I'm confused.
You want to have an intervention, Dan?
I'm just wondering, what are your guys' thoughts on this card, its position in the metagames in Modern and Pioneer up to this point?
Like, do we like it? Do we not like it? Do we think it's healthy? Do we think it's unhealthy?
Broadly speaking, and to clarify, I've already indicated that I think Urian is the one companion that is the least affected by all of these because the Urian decks have tended to just fill themselves up with cantrips and enter the battlefield effects and then just win eventually. It reminds me very much of like a suspend 8 win the game card.
That's a good point. I never thought about it that way, but yeah, that makes total sense.
So now it's suspend 9. So do you think this is a significant change?
I don't, but I'm willing to wait and see if that makes the card more or less problematic, because Urian sort of forces you to play a very slow, long game. And although Luris in some cases encouraged players to play hyper fast strategies, with less access to that, like we might have less of a Luris versus Urian metagame. And I think that could open up to maybe more interesting problem solving down the line and trying to deal with like the control strategy that Urian sort of fits really nicely into.
Yeah, I mean, I sort of just broadly feel that Urian isn't necessarily a companion that needs to be played on curve. You want to get max value out of it. Setting it back in this way isn't necessarily that bad, especially in a fires type deck like we talked about earlier. So I think we might still see some of the same unfortunate patterns that we don't love. I mean, because there's really no difference in, say, I have a fires down and I have available 6 mana. I was only going to cast 2 spells anyways this turn. One of them is going to be this Urian out of the sideboard, and I'm paying 3 mana I wasn't going to use. So is there really a tax? Not really.
Yeah, and it's worth mentioning that we weren't planning to talk about this, but it's worth mentioning that they did ban Fires of Invention in Standard. Jeskai Luca Fires was by far the best deck in Standard. And I think if they had just made the mana tax change without banning Fires from Standard, people would be quickly up in arms, say this is not going to help, where the Fires in play, like you're saying, that the mana tax is not a tax at all. So I think that goes hand in hand, at least for Standard, which is the format that they focus on the most with big changes like this. And then I think they're going to take a wait-and-see approach to Modern and Pioneer.
And I'm here for it. The article concludes that they have no current plans to make rule changes in the future, and they do think that this solution will be better than just banning cards altogether. That was a long article to read. We shared a lot of thoughts.
Yeah, and buried at the very end of that wonderful paragraphs from Hasbro is what I think is actually perhaps the most dangerous and troubling thing about this whole change. So we're talking about a functional errata to a flagship mechanic from a set. They did sort of warn us in advance that they were considering this, and I think Companion was such a controversial mechanic that I think players were mostly okay with that. But I think this is kind of we should be careful what we wish for. Yes, it is the case that Companion is reminder text, so it's not that big of a deal to change it, but do you want this to happen to your cards in the future, where you're looking at your card in the pack and you're not sure if it's going to do what it says it does a month from now?
I would rather that than the card just being strictly unplayable because it's banned. And not to play devil's advocate, but I think it may sound this way a little bit.
You love doing this.
I do, I guess. And I convince myself that I believe these things. One of the issues that Paper Magic has struggled with compared to something like Hearthstone or other digital card games is that once a card is printed, you can't change it. Like digital card games can tweak and Magic cannot. Or at least...
And they constantly do. I mean, like I've been playing a decent amount of Legends of Runeterra recently, and they're on like I think it's like maybe a bi-weekly tweak schedule right now, where you can expect some kind of minor response to the meta, every so often. And it's something that I think people actually look forward to, because it makes some significant meta changes even between printings of new cards, and can adjust like power level without just full stop bans. I think it's what you're getting at, Stan, right? This is kind of like a potential way for Wizards of the Coast to be able to do something like that.
Yeah, like this might just be a new solution to possibly prevent more cards from being banned in the future, or maybe like we've kind of gotten used to a very frequent cadence of bannings in the last like year or two. I want to say like really since 2009. And what if they try like printing really vague rules and mechanics that they can maybe tweak over time as they playtest in like the community? That could be a problem for Magic's future, but that could be also like a potentially exciting change as well. And I'm willing to see how that plays out, just because we don't really have a frame of reference of what that might be like in Magic in particular.
Are you still playing devil's advocate here, Stan, or is this sounds like a disastrous outcome for players who come to think of Magic as a paper game? And
Yeah.
if Magic cards, if they just cost wild cards, that would be okay. If it were actually a digital game, but it has to be both, just to respect sort of what it is for so many Magic paper players. And I don't think that's an outcome that I would want as someone who's accustomed to also playing in paper with cards that don't just get randomly changed in the middle of their lifespan.
Yeah, it's unfortunately, I don't think, very sustainable. Like with companions, we have this unique example because you can just say companions act differently. Like this is something we can as a blanket change, and it's not like Lurrus costs 2 more and Yorion costs 4 more and Yungatha costs 1 more.
Right, and I think like our tolerance for a change like what they're doing to the companion rule is going to be very different than perhaps our tolerance for changing like the power and toughness on creatures or the mana cost on creatures, because I think those are different things, right? Like
they just can't do it. It's just not sustainable.
Exactly.
They just did change the mana cost on these creatures, though. That's exactly what happened. And I mean, we're thinking in terms of, okay, that's better for competitive health, but I mean, what if you're not a competitive player and you had a Lurrus, a Urion, or anything, you had a Kahira, a Karuga, and you love that card, you built a deck around it, and now the next time you see someone, they say, oh, that costs 3 more now, by the way, because, the legacy players broke Zerda, so you get to pay 6 for your Zerda now. And you're like, I'm just a kitchen table player. Like, I'm not a Spike. Like, why is my card suddenly changed? I spent money on this. I got the foil version. It's just a dangerous path to go down. And I know they said this is not going to set a precedent. This is a one-time deal, but that's just not how precedents work. You mentioned bannings. We're just accustomed to them now. They used to apologize for bannings, and they do everything they could to not ban. And now they've figured out that players are used to it, and we've come to expect it.
And maybe we've come to enjoy it in some cases and
Yes.
really crave them even.
Yes. So, I mean, you may be right that this is actually a better path forward to embrace some of the things that make digital games a little more fresh, a little more responsive. But it's a huge change, and I don't think we should undersell that.
I think what this sort of gets to is the risk versus reward aspect for Wizards of the Coast. And we've talked about this in the pod, and I know I think Dave has sort of been on the side of you miss all the shots you don't take, and it makes the game exciting, and pushing in certain places is necessary to retain interest. And maybe we have got to the point where we're saying like, okay, this is interesting, and then maybe it's too interesting and needs to be reel back in, and then we have a ban come into place, and that's just the reality of the game. And I think that's the reality we have to face in a paper card game world. I don't think that we can continue to have small tweaks to mechanics, to card text. It's just not something that I think people can really deal with for some of the reasons that Dan mentioned and others on top of that, right? It's just not something that I think is inherent into a paper game. But I think that what's interesting about companions is it's something they could do. There's only 10 of them. It's sort of it's a blanket treatment. And I think that some of the cards will be still playable and some of them will not as much. Like there's no reason for Tron or humans to just throw a Jengatha in the side, because they're not going to want to pay the mana just to have it. Like right now, it's just an 8th card in your opener. In the future, it's probably too expensive for what you're getting. But like you said, Yorion maybe is something that's still awesome because you don't have to play it on curve.
Two-part question. Do you guys think that any companions are just dead, unplayable now? Or do you think any companions might actually be better now?
Well, this might not be the spirit in which you mean the question, but I think the really exciting thing to come from all this is that I think people will now seriously consider these companions as main deck cards. A lot of them strike me as cards that, if they didn't have the companion clause, they're actually still really unique, really attractive. I'm thinking of Gyruda, I'm thinking of Urian, Luris, even Karuga, Zerda. I mean, these are cards that if I didn't know companion was a thing and I just saw the text of these cards, I might want to put them in a 60-card deck. Before, you were allowed to do that, but I think what everyone realized quickly was that once you decided that your deck was interested in that effect, it was just more worth it to meet the condition so that you could play it as a companion.
Mm-hmm.
So we didn't actually see a deck that wanted a main deck Gyruda, but also was free to play odd cost spells. And now I think people will explore that space, and I think that's actually a really interesting space to explore.
Yeah, there was definitely something that people were saying about Luris when Luris was spoiled is, I'd run this without being a companion. So now we can put the rubber to the road, so to speak, give it a test, give it a spin, see what it's like, potentially.
Yeah, I mean, I do worry about Obosh in particular. Dan, how do you pronounce Obosh, by the way?
I say Obosh.
All right, cool.
What do you say?
I say Obosh, but
Okay.
our friend Aspiring Spike said Abush, and I just haven't stopped thinking about that ever since.
That's also what Lawson Zandy says. He's
Oh yeah,
another streamer that I like to watch for his crazy brews. He's Ubush, so maybe he comes from the Aspiring Spike school of companion dialects.
I think they're both in the Texas area, so
That's
think.
right.
wow, maybe it's a Lone Star accent. Yeah, like I said, I do wonder about Obosh in particular. I sort of have tunnel vision because of the decks that card has been played in, and like I don't necessarily see Panza wanting to run it main deck as like the curve topper, but you know, I'm not really great at brewing and tweaking per se until I've like played with a deck a lot. So I'm really excited to see where some of these other companions go. Zerda in particular, just like as this really powerful combo enabler. I wonder if it's still just like totally good enough and maybe even unfazed by some of these rule changes in Modern especially.
Yeah, you can take a wait and see approach, or if you just want to try it out yourself, my prediction would be that the decks that were able to generate lots of mana, so specifically Urian, Urza, or even the red-green Obosh decks, those are ramp decks in their own way. The green-red Arbor Elf Utopia Sprawl package generates a lot of mana, and there weren't really any even cost spells that you're really sad to lose, so I would probably just continue to play the Obosh versions until it was proven that they were not worth it.
Time will tell. Any parting thoughts before we wrap up this section and take a break before the dive down?
This is longer than our usual breakdown. Thanks, Dan.
Thanks for your articulate and thoughtful positions, Dan.
Jeez.
I mean, I'm okay with that because I feel like this is actually a momentous moment. A momentous moment. Those are the best kind of moments.
Yes.
We may look back on this as the day that, from now on, all keywords will just come without any explanation, and the card will just have a QR code on it so you can look up the current functionality.
Oh, man. I didn't think about that. Yeah, no reminder text. I don't want reminder text.
We could just play Magic on our smartphones.
Hmm?
All right, we're going to spend some time in the dive down talking about brewing and how the companion rule might impact brewing. So let's put a pin in the conversation here. We're going to take a quick break, and when we return, Cavedan from Faithless Brewing joins us in looking ahead, reconciling with some of the frustrating aspects of Magic's very recent history, and maybe taking inventory of the positives that keep us engaged as players and podcasters. Stay with us.
All right, we are back. And we got to be honest, right? Magic has been in an interesting / weird / new place for the last few months. You might think it's positive, you might think it's negative, you might just be living through it. The novel coronavirus is impacting our ability to gather and play in person with others. There's extremely powerful new cards, new mechanics that are changing the identity that many of us had in our minds when we thought of the formats we're playing. A lot of people are probably overwhelmed by Magic and perhaps life right now. And even this week, we see a rules change. Might be a relief to some people. up through last week, punches kept coming. We had, things that were impacting the things that many of us thought were just the rules of the game that we were playing and how we were playing it and how we were experiencing it in our lives. Last week, announcement that all remaining GPs are canceled. Our Planeswalker points histories were considered unnecessary and were unceremoniously deleted from the intranet. The Magic community is going through a little bit of an identity crisis, perhaps, right now. We try to figure out what the game is in the future, figure out what normal is and possibly could be for the game and how we experience it and engage with it. Today's episode, of course, we wanted to get together with our friend of the show, fellow Magic lover, podcast and video YouTube superstar, Dan Shriver, aka Cavedan. Do a little exercise, look ahead, look at how we can embrace some of the things that keep this game and this community fun and engaging for us. Share some insights and thoughts about how we think about and perhaps cope with the game that might stress us out. To be clear, if you're unhappy with Magic right now, thanks for still listening to us. Thanks for engaging with the game through us. We appreciate that. There's not much we can say to suddenly change your mind about what's going on, but what we can do, take stock of where we're at as players and as people who engage with the game and with the community, talk about those feelings and ideas off of another awesome player and member of the community and content creator that we admire, and look ahead together. Because whether it comes to Magic or other gaming communities or life in general, the future is going to be different. That's not necessarily bad, right? That was the initial spiel. Teed it up nicely, Stan. I think Stan wrote this, right? Stan wrote this, and I read it for some reason, and I loved reading it.
Listen,
that's a little peek behind the curtain.
Listen,
y'all.
I have a journalism degree, and I get to write sometimes, and this is how I express myself, and it meant a lot to me to hear you put your own spin on it.
That was beautiful.
Oh man, it's dusty in here. Someone's putting up some drywall right now.
So I think that a lot of what you're saying for me, well, obviously it resonates a lot. Maybe it's just that as being on the content creation side of things, we're more plugged in than most, but I definitely have come across a lot of these sentiments. I've felt this way myself. And I think a lot of it boils down to just the pace of change. It makes me wonder, is that ultimately what we're talking about here? Like the role of change in the game of Magic? This is something that Mark Rosewater talks about all the time on his articles, on his blog, how change is necessary to keep a game healthy and alive after, I don't know how many years, 27 years? Is that what it's been?
Yeah, it's like what, like 93, I think Alpha was, 94.
Yeah, so the fact that we're still here talking and playing this game, talking about it, and just being absorbed in it, it's in many ways bigger than it's ever been. That obviously would not be possible if the game did not stay fresh, interesting. But at some point, we do also have to ask, is it too much? Is that what people are sort of struggling with? The sort of, you mentioned, wave after wave, hit after hit. There's an idea that modern has just gone from crisis to crisis.
Yeah. It's like sort of starting with War of the Spark almost. You know what I mean? Like perhaps before that, right? But it sort of felt like since War of the Spark and including War of the Spark, people have, with the Modern Horizons, we talked all about this, late last year, right? We're just talking about the year of 2019 and how much what felt like fundamental change to the game. And that's happened. That's been for the first 5 months of 2020 too.
Yeah. So if we break it down like further, it's not necessarily even just one thing, right? On a show like the Dive Down, we're interested in things like the tournament scene, what decks are changing, what cards are coming in and out of favor. That's just one side of it. There's even just the sheer volume of products that are being thrown at you. Magic has become kind of similar to the 24/7 news cycle almost. It seems like we're always in a spoiler season. Yeah. It used to be 4 sets a year. How many sets do you think were released last year or this year?
Are we talking like constructed sets or just kind of like cards to buy or pay attention to type thing?
The latter, official releases from Wizards.
Man,
10?
7? I don't know, 7 to 10.
So 10 is the correct answer for this calendar year from 2020 from now through the beginning of June.
So 5 months.
Yeah, year to date, 10 have been released and 8 more have been announced, and that's grouping all the secret layers as a single product.
Oh my.
Last year it was 20 products, and I'm just looking at this website, MTG Picks or something like that. And many of these things are things that, I kind of forgot about them, but they did happen. I remember sort of seeing them. At a certain point, you get numb to them. Like, did you know there's something called Double Masters that not only has been announced, but many people are outraged about?
Yeah, Double Masters. 2 for the price of 1.
Double,
unfortunately,
the rares.
2 for the price of 2.
Double the outrage.
I mean, yeah, and I don't mean to laugh or belittle the people who feel legitimately like disappointed in the pricing, but it's the kind of thing where there's just so much happening that it does start to feel like, man, this is maybe it's too much to keep up with, and the refrain, oh, this product maybe it's just not aimed at you, can only get you so far. So that's just the new products, the metagame changes, and then everything else, whether that's organized play changes or just anything newsworthy that drops or trends, any little scandal or things that seem like transitions, steps taken towards digital, erratas, bans. That's all just sort of happening at a pace that feels to me faster than it has ever felt in the past.
And how do you feel about that? Like, can we do a quick temperature check? One of my favorite things to do on the podcast, whenever we introduce a topic, do you share some of that frustration? Do you share some of that product and wallet fatigue? And I'd be curious to hear what Shane thinks as well.
I definitely understand where those complaints are coming from. So as someone like looking for new things to talk about and not feeling like I need to buy them, I'm okay with that. Yeah. It's great for just like having things to talk about and staying engaged. But that also, the flip side of that is that, who or what are you engaging with? And you do end up having to engage with backlash and negativity. And that, I think, is something that I would like to just sort of take a step back and say, well, wait a second here. Maybe if we are getting very stressed out by this state of affairs, that's not the way it should be. And maybe that's something that we at least can change for ourselves to not have such a draining experience in what is ostensibly our hobby that we, enjoy and find relaxing.
Yeah, and of course, there's some compounding factors too. And we kind of talked about this in the intro to the Dive Down, which is, we have the novel corona pandemic, we have our in-person play, which is many of us, and I think many of our listeners, was their primary way of engaging with each other, their friends, their local community, and the game on the whole, right? So you have to figure out, what is this game to me if it's not interacting with my paper cards and putting together my deck and sleeving up these cards and putting them in the deck boxes that I love. And like, to both of you, I have not purchased a paper Magic card in nearly 3 months. Do you know how insane that is? The last card, I have not purchased a single Magic card since March 2nd. Okay? I bought Gideon of the Trials. March 2nd was they ordered. I checked it recently. That's why I knew it. It's because I have no reason to buy a paper Magic card. And I hate it. You know what I mean? Like, I'm sure my wife likes it because I'm not organizing cards in the guest room where I keep all my stuff. I'm not like moving cards around. I don't have like stacks of stuff on my dresser where like I'm like, oh, these are in process. These are my in process, like to be filed cards. Like it's, I mean, sometimes it's like a little bit mentally clearing, but it's like my engagement with the paper game doesn't exist. And that's a big change. I know it's a big change for you, Stan. I assume you, Dan, and I'm sure a high percentage of our listeners.
Yeah, man, I can relate. I really, really, really miss going to the local game store. Like, I just can't understate how much that was a part of my social life. How many like friends I just haven't seen since quarantine started because like jamming cards on Wednesday Night Modern was like one of our recurring social engagements that we got to look forward to. So I can definitely relate to that, and the adjustment to not experiencing the paper part of the game. That said, I am still buying cards, and I think part of that is because it's a habit that's hard for me to kick. But like, I was at Walgreens getting some like toilet paper and dish soap, and they had their last pack of Eldraine, and I bought a pack of Eldraine, and I cracked open a Heliod, and I felt good.
Oh, that's sweet. I mean, but okay, so we've kind of set the table here, right? Like what is there for us to be sort of disconcerted about. But I think the better question is what can we do to respond to the change, potential uncertainty, potential, discontentment that many of us and our listeners are feeling. Like, if it feels like it's too much to deal with, something that we thought was the status quo has now been changed or taken away from us. Like, what are you thinking? Like, Dan, you're our guest. What's kind of the things that pops into your mind, like on how you're keeping things in perspective?
Oh gosh. Yeah, I just have some random thoughts on this, and I find myself thinking them frequently. So I'll just throw a couple things out there, and maybe you guys can help me keep things in better perspective. The first thing is that there is a lot of negativity, and when I kind of unpack that a little bit more, it's negativity specifically on the internet or in social media. I guess I've come to realize that that's kind of like, that had been a countervailing force to like playing in person. There's the idea that like Magic is out there. It's a game that we talk about on these internet forums, and whatever is like the problems in Magic exist there, and we come into contact with them whenever we engage with Magic content or read about it, go on Reddit or Twitter, God forbid. But then like you go to your game store, you sit down and play some games with your friends, and you remember that like, this is also what it's all about. Like, this is like my happy place. And when that's just sort of indefinitely just taken away due to the situation with the pandemic, there's no longer a balance in the force.
I think that's so big. And that was one of the things that I think kept me going personally when like Oko had taken over the format, when Hogak had taken over the format. I would go to the local game store and I wasn't playing nonstop Oko and Hogak games. I was still just like playing fun games of Magic with my friends and the decks that my friends loved and had been mastering. So it still felt more like a community that I was a very active participant in, as opposed to like a large, broad game community that I was just trying to like claw my way into through Magic Online, faceless, nameless games of Magic Online, where sometimes I don't even chat with my opponent.
Never look at the chat.
Yeah, and I know that this approach or this perspective will not be satisfying to someone who's like really plugged in as a grinder playing, MPL members that has to reckon with a broken metagame month after month.
So all the MPL players listening to us, we apologize for not giving you relevant content.
Yeah, I'm not going to apologize for that. I'm okay with that. And I feel like people need to remember that a lot of the narrative out there, in some ways it's not disconnected from what the sort of hardcore tournament players are expressing. They have a lot of followers, and your voice matters too. If you are like enjoying Magic, that's fine. You don't have to feel bad about that.
Also, if you are an MPL player and do listen to this podcast, I honestly want to know. Like, I need you to tweet at us and say, "Hey, I am a high level player and I enjoy your podcast," because that would be mildly validating to be like, this really good player actually likes what we're doing. Like, they don't think we're complete idiots.
This high level player took a break from the auto battlers that they've been jamming online to listen to our podcast. Yeah. Can I interrupt? I want to share a little insight into my kind of approach to Magic historically, and maybe how that's kind of changed since the quarantine started. And maybe Shane, you can like confirm that these are things that I've shared with you and I'm not just sort of like playing a part per se, because I've often approached Magic with a bit of ambivalence with regard to the forces that I cannot control. And a lot of that has been my ability to kind of like focus on a handful of decks that I really enjoy and just kind of like jam them through hell and high water. Like, for a long time, I would just play like blue-red control, blue-moon style decks, whether or not they were good, and would try to like tweak them to whatever the meta was. If it was Oko, I'd play Pyromancer. If it was humans, I'd play Thing in the Ice, what have you. Mm-hmm. And for me, like the most important thing at the end of the day has always been that like I can just draw cards, cast spells, and tap my mana. Like, it's the physical actions of the game itself that I find really compelling and engrossing. And I've said before, like, I always frame my experience with the game from the LGS first. Like, for me, MTGO was always about practicing decks that I can then take to the LGS. But that's really changed this year, because the LGSs can't really support games anymore, so I only have to play online, and kind of remind myself that like it's still the same actions of the game that kept me compelled with it. You know, whether or not it's the same deck or not, I still just love the act of like managing these cards and drawing them and tapping them and finding solutions to whatever the card pool I have access to. And that's because that's what's within my control. And when things like powerful new cards get printed or companions get banned or nerfed, like that wasn't up to me, and all I can really do is react and like continue to play like the parts of the game that I love most and try to like maintain that sense of ambivalence, because like at the end of the day, like Dan, what you're alluding to, like this isn't a zero-sum game. Like at the end of the day, like we're just trying to have fun with the parts of Magic that we enjoy most. And for some of us, that's brewing. For some of us, that's drawing cards. For some of us, that's naming the exact right target with Meddling Mage.
Game one, no less.
In the blind.
Can you guys relate? Like, do you either of you share that like ambivalence, or do you find yourself like getting kind of like worked up or emotional about like these things that feel like forces that are forced upon us that we just kind of have to endure?
That resonates with me so much. And I think that some people would think that you're referring to, you know, decisions made on the corporate side. And that's one thing. But I experience it as, you know, the force that I cannot actually push back against is, you know, the swirling mass of opinions on Reddit or Twitter, for example. And I've tried shouting back into the void at them, say, hey, you know, maybe there's another way of looking at it. And it's almost futile. So in that sense, like, yeah, I need a coping strategy for that as well.
I think, Stan, one of the things that's tough for me is that I'm sort of results oriented, right? Which is like, I want to see the ability to like be successful and have sort of like decisions that feel like they matter, or that I can feel like I can have some time to get pretty good with a strategy, and that I can still get good at something when I'm playing maybe like, you know, one league a week, or like I'm going to the LGS like 3 times a month, right? And with the changes to the speed at which things feel like they're changing, and the power level of cards being injected into the card pool, and the impacts of, you know, the coronavirus pandemic, I think that those are some of the reasons that it makes it feel like it's more challenging, or like I can't get to the LGS, and I'm sort of forced to engage with the highly competitive environment of Magic Online that has a far more dynamic metagame that responds to what is considered kind of the best decks out there. And you're not going to see, you know, the person who's running Soul Sisters on Magic Online as you might see running at the LGS, or like the Super Friends friend before Super Friends was a good deck. You know, you're going to see them at the LGS. But in thinking about, what I want to talk about right now is kind of one of the things I think there is to be positive about. I mean, we've been hinting at this concept of the episode, which is, okay, we have some limitations, we have some obstacles, we have some external stimuli that can be seen as frustrating or challenging to overcome. But I think there are a lot of things to be positive about. And I want to talk about some of those things with you all. You ready for this?
Dun, dun, dun.
One of the things that I like in the response to the challenges of physical meeting and physical play right now, there are and will be new ways to play, both now and in the future. I think there's a gradual and perhaps necessary shift for the health and engagement of newer players that are more used to a digital environment. There's a shift to digital Magic. And I think that can be anxiety inducing for many of us who have played primarily paper, perhaps, over the past years. I am almost certainly primarily a paper player. And, you know, when I first started playing, Stan, I know you played before. I mean, Magic Online existed, but when I started playing, there wasn't even Magic Online. You know, the summer of '95 when I played like 4th edition and Ice Age. But when I came back, of course, there was Magic Online, and I did a lot of really bad cons drafts, because a new player playing cons drafts is, you're asking for trouble. But I think what's cool about the digital realm of Magic is that it gives opportunities that have never been seen before to both established tournament players, but also to those who haven't had real opportunities before to participate and engage in high-level tournament play. And you might be thinking, Shane, what do you mean by that? There's plenty of ways for everyone to engage in some kind of tournament play, right? And I was thinking that actually, I think I've seen it be pretty narrow, because many of them have involved being physically present, which is a really limiting factor. There's physical barriers, mental barriers, monetary barriers in the game of paper Magic that many of us may be privileged enough not to have to appreciate those barriers. Magic Online has offered ways for people to play high-level digital Magic, but most of us who have played Magic Online are likely willing to admit there's frustrations and issues and barriers with that platform as well. There's time investment issues, even with Magic Online tournaments, because they essentially are mirroring what's happening in paper, right? You have to wait for every round to finish. You have to devote a large portion of your time in a single long sitting. And that's a significant limitation for a lot of people. Maybe you've got kids. Maybe you've got people that you take care of. Maybe you've got a really weird job. Maybe you work the gig economy and you can't sit in front of your computer for 8 hours. There's all sorts of reasons that might happen, right? Those are limitations. That's the reason that leagues have been so popular. But leagues are just one way to engage and don't have super high. They don't have the tournament chops, or the tournament results rather, or the benefits of participating in something like a GP, right? So responses to that before I move on. Some more thoughts about digital engagement. Good, none. Okay.
No,
I heard you breathe in, Dan. I was just cutting you off.
I totally agree. And I wonder if this has to do with the moment we're living in now because of COVID, or if this is just the inevitable, conclusion of this game becoming more and more and more digital, as there are more ways to play with it online and more ways to engage with Magic in the existing platforms. But I love seeing these new community tournaments that have been popping up. We talked about the Team Lotus Box ones in some of our previous breakdowns. Friend of the show, Aspiring Spike, organized a No Ban Modern tournament. Popular streamer Jeff Hoogland hosted a tournament. We talked about mtgmelee.com as a way to organize your own tournaments online. I mean, any day now, we're going to have a Dive Down versus Faithless Brewing grudge match.
Oh, yeah. We'll lose.
because we'll have no idea what they're playing.
We'll make you brew the decks, and then we'll pick tier decks just to do a Freaky Friday situation here.
Oh man, you've seen my brewing. It's not good, Dan. It's not good. It's deeply flawed. What were you thinking, Dan?
Well, I think that the way you framed it in terms of making the game more accessible is something that just needs to be repeated. We talk about the enfranchised Magic player and it's a luxury hobby, but even acknowledging that, I think we still don't think about just how enfranchised we are, especially, as Magic skews North American and European.
That's a good point too. The geographic constraints.
Yeah. So something you mentioned, Stan, about, these changes are not necessarily zero sum. And I think that's just an important way to keep that in mind when you come across something like, okay, there's no more paper tournaments for the rest of the year because of the pandemic. And as a response, high-level play is switching to digital. You can read that as, they've taken away my beloved paper play and given it to the digital players. But I just encourage people to just sort of step back and realize that the game has to be big enough to encompass more players than we can just sort of have on our radar at any given time.
What I like too about the digital environment and the digital tournaments, especially as they sort of expand onto Arena, we're getting things like a historic players tour. That's a new format only on Arena, basically. And they have hinted at and essentially promised the existence of Pioneer on Magic Arena. So hopefully we see that one day. They're experimenting with asynchronous methods of tournament play, where you don't have to just sit there all day to win something big, right? And so that gives people with dynamic schedules, with other things that they're responsible for, to engage in tournament Magic that doesn't require a huge amount of time with a lot of downtime, which is a major issue when it comes to tournament play. I mean, I'm sure you've watched streamers on doing a tournament where they're like, how do I kill this downtime? I guess I'm going to put on a YouTube and we'll riff on the YouTube for a while. And that's
we're going to watch Top Chef.
I would love to watch Top Chef, honestly. But
I think that's what Yama does.
He is a different kitchen competition one. But anyway, I mean, this is not a bash on Yama by any means. I just think it's something that it's a fun thing to do, but it's like a necessary evil I think people would love to be watching some Magic, right?
Yeah.
And so I think that is an advantage to be looking at too, is like I can be doing a tournament that doesn't have a lot of downtime. And I think that is a huge boon and lots of potential for the future, and an asynchronous way of having a real Magic tournament.
You know, even though we're kind of sharing our love letter to digital Magic, do either of you sincerely think that the end of paper is actually in sight?
No, of course not. No, that would be... I don't think so. Do you?
I don't. I mean, almost 30 years of making paper products that the game has continued to grow this community and this game with. Like, I don't see that just going away without like fundamental systemic change and people just outright not buying those cards anymore.
Let me pose it as another hypothetical. So let's say that Wizards announced that from now on, they're just not going to print paper Magic anymore. What would happen to your paper cards? Would you just throw them away?
No.
Or would you go buy up everyone else's paper cards and play them with your friends?
Yeah, man, what a weird scenario to imagine. Like, I don't actually have an answer because like it's hard to imagine what that would do to the value of cards. Part of me thinks that it would make them like highly sought after collector's item, and like a lot of people's paper collections suddenly get even more valuable. The opposite might also be true, and they lose all value overnight. But
yeah, I'm an EV guy. Like, you know, it's all about like how much play am I going to get out of these cards? And I'm not quick to, but I am willing to look at my collection and be like, am I going to be playing paper in the near future? Do I feel like I can buy back in for potentially less or the same at what I sell at? Like, what's my concern here? Like, you know, well, how much value am I holding that I could turn into something else in the meantime? And so I do have a lot of sentiment towards my paper collection and to paper Magic, but I'm also definitely willing to be realistic with myself. To be honest with you,
Shane, does that realism mean that you think they might stop making paper Magic in the foreseeable future?
Not the foreseeable future. I'm less concerned about paper Magic being less popular and paper Magic being not a real thing, but I'm sort of more worried in terms of like, how much am I going to use certain cards, right? Like if I'm playing a lot more Pioneer than I am Modern, am I willing to pare down my fetch land collection? Maybe I'll just keep 8 fetches that I know are my favorite deck. You know what I mean? Stuff like that. And so that's the kind of stuff that I think about, because it's like, well, am I just going to put money into Pioneer, more money into Pioneer and keep my same old Modern cards? Or am I going to sort of reallocate money there? And I don't want to go down this road too much, but I do think that paper Magic is going to have a place because that's the way a lot of people prefer to engage with the game.
The evidence suggests that paper Magic, there's just more of it than ever before. I mean, we talked about all the products that are coming out. There's so many products being released. And I think a lot of people are thinking, oh my gosh, so many, I can't keep up with all of them. You don't have to. That's okay. They don't have to be things you have to go buy. But I think it's better that the game is growing. And the signs point to Magic was having great years prior to, obviously, the economic impacts of the current recession that we're in.
Are there any kind of releases, speaking of those, Dan, that either of you are looking forward to? The ones on the horizon? Like you said, there's a lot of stuff due this year. What are you thinking about?
The one that I'm most excited for right now is Ikoria Lair of Behemoths, which just releases on Thursday, I think. The Composed Companion Ikoria will be out soon. It's amazing to just sort of think about, you know, every time we get a fresh meta. So that's like a really exciting time. And it's like we're getting that twice. Of course, Core Set 2021 previews will have already started, I think, by the time this episode comes out. So it's hard to choose. It's a feast for the...
I can't wait to try Jumpstart. And I think this might be the way I finally get my fiance to try Magic. She likes games. She's never tried Magic. She's never been particularly interested in Magic. But when I explained this concept of Jumpstart to her, just like crack a pack, play a game, it seemed like it could be a viable selling point. And we don't know what cards are in there yet, so there may be really cool reprints. But also, like, I love this concept of basically this new mini game of Magic that's tied to this like class of products that I think is going to be reasonably costed compared to some master sets. I think that's kind of cool.
Yeah, man. Any way that gets new players interested in the game or gives us a novel way to play Magic has typically been at least fun in the past. So I'm glad that you're excited. I think it's a cool idea. I mean, Zendikar is a cool plane. We've got Zendikar coming in October. There's going to be some cool cards in there.
Probably no Eldrazi.
They guaranteed no Eldrazi, right? More or less, I hope.
You promised. I will accept a Hedron, but nothing more. If I see a tentacle, I send it back.
I think if you're listening to us talk about the things we're looking forward to, you can tell that we trend towards the modern and planar competitive scenes. But even among the Dive Down listenership, there are secret Commander fans and secret Arena Standard players out there.
Oh, yeah.
It's interesting to just sort of stop by those other communities. Go to the Reddit EDH community. They're having a great time over there. It's the year of Commander. There's just so much to enjoy. Or something else you could try that I've had the chance to do lately is just try teaching a friend how to play. Or you meet a child who just learned Magic and they're so excited to find out that you play this game too. And you remember in those moments that the game is just sort of bigger than even the small things that we focus on in our podcasting lives.
Yeah, that kind of naturally transitions into kind of one of the next big points I wanted to focus on with you both. And that's the game is still great. Like fundamentally, the game is a great game to play. It's the reason that all of us are so captivated by it. It's the reason that we have people that listen to this podcast, I think, is that it's an amazing game to be engaged with. Right. And I think one of the primary things that makes it so great to me is that the gameplay is uniquely fun and uniquely thoughtful in an ongoing and dynamic way. Like, I think Magic diehards would say it's the greatest game ever made. And I think that's likely true because there's no game that is like it and that can compare to it because of its longevity. It has a card pool that no other TCG or CCG can touch. It has creative designers, creative developers, talented staff that are consistently making and giving us new tools, a really tight rules system, and the amazing community of judges that understand and help us enforce that rules system. It has crazy mechanics that give us these really deep levels of play, counterplay, interactions, and just fun, right?
I think it's no accident that all of the TCGs and CCGs and online CCGs are in some ways spin-offs of Magic.
Exactly.
Is that just because Richard Garfield was a genius and got it right the first time?
Yes.
Well, probably yes, but it's also exactly what you were saying, Shane, about just the sheer resources and brain power and experience that has been assembled to work on Magic and sort of shepherd it through its life is just massive. I mean, go back and look at some of these great designer searches from the past. Just a collective outpouring of energy and creativity from people passionate about this game, and the best of them, get sort of swept up into the I don't know what you call it, just the R&D brain trust. Really, in terms of just like having access to the best game design, Magic is comfortably situated in that respect.
Earlier this year, after Klothys got printed and I was playing against Panza on MTGO, I started to recognize that this deck is good and this card is dope, and I wanted to try it myself, and I did, and I had a lot of fun playing it, to the point that I started building it in paper because, like I said earlier, old habits die hard. But in picking up this new strategy that I really had no experience with before, I continue to surprise myself as a Magic player and kind of student of this game at my ability to keep leveling up and learning new heuristics and finding new ways to improve as a player and a thinker. And I feel like identifying heuristics and best practices whenever I pick up a new deck, in any format, is one of the not only most exciting things about like playing this game over a longer period of time, but I think that also speaks to kind of this point that we're talking about, is that this game is so complex and it's so fun that you can never learn everything. And like even the greatest players of all time, they're not just in first place in every tournament that they play in, because there's always new challenges. Part of that has to do with variance, but part of that has to do with like there's so many brilliant minds, coalescing around this game that you can never actually be the best. There's no Mozart. We're all Soriarty? What was Mozart?
What?
What was that movie, Amadeus? Come on, you guys. Someone.
James Moriarty, the villainous foil to Mozart.
Yeah, that's the one. That's the one. Someone who's listening to this podcast is screaming at their radio.
I mean, that makes me think, Stan, is like what you're really talking about is like an opportunity to keep learning and keep having new like gameplay opportunities. And I think that it's really informed by like the card pool, right? The card pool of the formats that we focus on here in Pioneer and Modern are just so huge. And then we keep getting new additions to that huge card pool. And I think that it's easy to kind of overlook the opportunities that gives to players of all types to engage with the game on the whole, because we have so many cards. We have so many different formats. Like Dan mentioned EDH earlier. He also mentioned just the kitchen table player as well, Dan, right? Like, I don't really think that the concepts of like, Tammy, Jenny, and Spike are like these universal truths or anything like that, but there's certainly something for everyone in the game of Magic. There's formats for every budget. There's a level of competitive drive is supported. Brewers, Faithless Brewing, right? You can enjoy discovering really cool interactions and untapped power of cards that people are overlooking. If you've ever played another game like Hearthstone, like Eternal, like Runeterra, like Gwent, all those games, you probably faced the issue of a limited card pool creating a sense of boredom or predictable gameplay. Like, what's going to happen because the decks are very much the same from even week to week to month until new cards are injected into the card pool. But or they might have extended formats that they don't exist because they don't have the card pool for it, or they're not really actively curated. You might have something like, my understanding of Wild and Hearthstone, for instance, is that it's not really highly curated. It is kind of wild. There's things that sort of take over the meta for a while. You might have limited opportunities for your expression through your deck building because of the limited card pool of these games. But that's never an issue in Magic, right? Besides it maybe like the very peak of the highest level of competitive gameplay where we have like meta decks that are established. You don't have any of these issues with Magic because there's just so much to do with all the cards that we have available over like the 27 years of Magic's existence.
Cards are good, man.
There's so much in what you said just there, Shane, that I feel like, +1 on all of that. For me, it's about like the opportunities that Magic provides to like play your way and find the way that you like to engage with the game. You don't have to play everything, right? It's just actually like many games within the same game, right? Like Magic is many communities, many ways to play. But there's always something to learn, and you can really set your own goalposts. You guys talk about it all the time, right? Whether that's learning goals or just getting better at a deck. For me, it's like I'm just trying to explore new cards and see what I can find out about them. And that's great. I think that's a huge feature of Magic, just like the treasure trove of riches of like ways to play and ways to think about it.
I think I've kind of been hinting to it, like this concept that the changes feel dynamic in perhaps a negative way sometimes, but I think there's also a positive spin on that, which is that there's always new puzzles to solve. And that's something that stuck with me that Jerry and Brian over on Arena Deck Lists mentioned months and months ago, maybe even a year ago now, which is like Magic is the greatest game because it's always a new puzzle to be solved, right? And it's a puzzle for us to work through and think about. And the game is changing in ways we can't ever predict, right? Like, who would have thought that companions would have been a thing? Like just the existence of companions would have been a thing. It would have seemed crazy. And then it was a thing. And the way that we approach and play and evaluate and try to win matches of Magic constantly is changing. So that's very engrossing, right? But, of course, we can find the speed of that change frustrating.
Yeah, and I think that could be a double-edged sword, because what that makes me think of, this concept of this changing puzzle, is this notion that's been coming up a lot. We've mentioned it once or twice on the show, which is that people in the community will sometimes say that Modern has become a rotating format and has lost its initial mission and identity of being a place where people can have one deck they love that they play forever. And as much as I totally understand where that notion is coming from based on like how rapidly this format has changed over the last couple of years, the notion hasn't always sat right with me either, because as quickly and frequently as it seems to change, like every new set and every subsequent ban, onward and upward, it always feels to me like we keep seeing the same cast of characters kind of come in and out of the top tiers of the format and of the metagame. And it feels like tier 1 changes every time a new set comes out, but sometimes that tier 1 is humans, sometimes that tier 1 is Burn, sometimes that tier 1 is Tron, and sometimes it's all those decks at once. And I mention humans because like that's a deck that, you know, for the last couple months, really since Companions have come out, has seen some play, but has been more or less absent from like the highest levels of successful competitive Modern. And that may be unfortunate for people who love that deck, and maybe that's their one deck that they play, and perhaps they've been really struggling with it because of its position. But do either of you think like a deck like Humans, for instance, or other really powerful decks in Modern that have seen their heyday and maybe have fallen out of favor, do you think they ever really die forever? Or do you think it's just a matter of like hibernation until new cards come out or something changes in the meta and they become better finally?
It's probably hibernation, but even if it isn't, even if a deck does die forever, this is something that I've come to think about more as I'm seeing people calling for a return to like the golden age of Modern. And where would that be? Some people have said, oh, if only we could just turn back the clock on undo 2019.
Yeah.
If you guys heard of Project Modern by any chance, it's sort of a return to pre-war, the spark. As you know, that's what Modern should be, or for some people, it's the Splinter Twin era of Modern was, you know, the Modern everyone should play. That's fine. I'm not saying you shouldn't go play that. I encourage everyone to play their own way, as I've been saying. But I think we shouldn't undersell the role that change and dynamic change has in keeping everything that we love about the game of Magic. That's essential to have change and churn, like you guys are saying. Whether that's metagame churn or new cards, new things, new mechanics, shaking things up. Nostalgia has a place, but I mean, even Project Modern, I think they're discovering that they have to add the new sets in. They can't just freeze the game. They could, but it just wouldn't be as fun. You know, we're not just picking our favorite, the best standard of all time was Return to Ravnica Standard. We're not just playing that every week.
Right? You mean cons? Thank you.
Well, your faction of the you can. That's the beautiful thing about it. You can do that. You can do that.
everyone's first standard that they really engage in is the best standard, right?
Hey, you might be onto something, man. You might be onto something.
I mean, that's the core of it, right? There's this sense of like, there's a greatness to Magic, and are we supposed to try to preserve that by keeping everything the same? Or is it like, I think there's that instinct that, you know, we react to all these changes and it's too fast, and so we're kind of afraid of it. But it has to change, and change is not necessarily a bad thing. You might find a new favorite in the next set.
Yeah, and the amount of people that I've really seen actually leave the game is so small, right? Like I think it's the change is really what keeps us engaged and keeps the game engaging. And I think that WotC is I think they've already made it overt that the speed of change may be pushed a little bit too hard recently, and that they know this, but their lead time is so long that, you know, be prepared for some increased change, and then we know we have to dial it back type thing. So we know that WotC is listening, and that they have a goal for the level of, you know, satisfaction people have with the game. And I think that that's an important thing to realize, is that WotC does listen. They do make changes. They do respond, maybe not in the pace that we want, but we do have a group of people who is very interested in making the game enjoyable for as many people as possible, because it's good for them and their bottom line, and for us as players.
So WotC does make these changes. They do listen to us. And I think that we as a community often rejoice when that happens. And that kind of brings me back to this notion about the gathering portion of Magic, and how much, like, more often than not, that's always been my favorite thing about the game. That it is a multiplayer experience. It's something that I get to, like, engage with my friends, make new friends, sometimes just, like, have really interesting, challenging games against strangers that I feel really good about when I win because I don't know who they are and I may have just ruined their day, and I'm a little competitive in that way.
Yeah, I kind of look at Magic, like the Magic, the game can be like a board game, right? Where like, I'm sure both of you guys have some board games. They sit on your shelf. And every once in a while, maybe not as often as you want, you've got some friends over, you take the board game off the shelf because it just made sense at the time. Magic is a game that you can always play somewhere at any time. So Magic is just a game like that without the community of people that surrounds it, whether that's other players, whether that's writers that you're reading, podcasts that you're listening to, streamers that you're watching. You have to have people to engage with the game in some way in order to make it what it is. And that's like I think my favorite part, honestly, about the game is that it inspires so many other people to engage with it along with you at all times.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, think about how much of the time you spend engaging with Magic is actually spent shuffling cards and playing games of Magic.
Yeah, not that much.
It's probably a pretty small percentage, right? Yeah, exactly. And I think that's great.
If you run fetch lands, like at least 5%.
Fair enough, touche. That being said, right, I mean, it's this game outside of the game, and, you know, the metagame, that word's already been claimed for tournament scenes, but it's everything else, you know, the entire ecosystem of Magic.
Yeah, like the meta dash game, like the whole environment of it. And there's just always so much conversation taking place, right? In every facet of the game.
And I think you could easily make the case that that's better than it has ever been. The way that we are able to connect with each other, whether that's, you know, finding small communities around a certain archetype, or just finding a streamer you like and just checking in with them whenever they go live, and you end up seeing little communities build up around that. If you have a question for Huey Jensen or Reed Duke, you can just, you know, send them a question in their chat and they'll reply to you. It's amazing what is possible now. Even just sort of the tone of the community has improved year by year. So I even here, I don't want to undersell the role of change. I don't think it's the case that we have to be, you know, trying to be nostalgic for it the way it used to be. I think it can continue to get better.
Yeah, I've heard horror stories since I've gotten more involved with Magic over the last 5 or 6 years about like how much more toxic the community used to be and how much more exclusive it was to like minority players, like women, people who are gender non-binary, and it, you know, used to be this exclusive and maybe in some cases a really ugly boys club, and like that's just not the Magic community that I've ever been a part of since I've started playing, and
yeah,
I love that.
Yeah, and you only have to stumble once into a community that is not like that, like for a different game, to really appreciate, you know, how wonderful and special what the Magic community has built itself towards, you know, through a lot of hard work. It didn't just happen randomly. A lot of people stood up to try to say, hey, this is what we want our community to be.
And one of the things I like about the community too is like how granular it can be, and like because it's so large, how like niche certain things can be or broad certain things can be. Like you can have a Discord for a deck, for a regional area. You can have a Facebook page for your specific store, or you can have like a giant subreddit, like, you know, for Modern Magic or for Pioneer. And I think that that's all really cool, right? Like you can engage in as niche and as local as you want, or as broad as you want.
So this community of content creators that we sometimes refer to, one of my favorite parts about it, and I have to admit I'm super lucky and privileged that I even get to do this, is that every once in a while I get to invite someone who I like admire and am a fan of onto this podcast that I make with my friends, and get to just ask them stupid questions, listen to them disagree with my stupid opinions, and it's a thrill. And Dan, as long as we have you here, I would be absolutely remiss if I did not get to ask you some questions about brewing, because that is a blind spot of the Dive Down. So just a few weeks ago, we had Aspiring Spike on the show, and we touched on brewing briefly, and he actually shared his approach to brewing, and I kind of want to compare that to yours, because Everett said that when he wants to brew up a deck, or when he starts thinking about a new deck, it often comes from the perspective of identifying a card or a synergy that he thinks is powerful and can maybe even actively attack a metagame. But from listening to Faithless Brewing, I've gotten the sense that you guys will often, if not usually, take a different approach, where it's more to do with actually identifying cards that you just think are cool, interesting, or novel, and trying to make them work.
Yeah, I think that's a fair way of putting it. I think of Faithless Brewing as we run science experiments every week. So, we structure the show around a card of the week and we brainstorm, 3, 4, 5 different ways to use it. We propose some lists and then we test them. We come back the next week and report back on how we did. In some ways, I make that list of cards in my head as soon as the set is released. I kind of just have a roadmap. I go through the spoiler and I'm like, well, these cards look interesting. And as the weeks go by, some of them, the community at large has worked on a lot, and there's just no need for me to explore it because I feel like it's already been explored. And others, like, it's not that it's something that I think is particularly well positioned in a metagame. I just want to learn what makes a card tick. So I think maybe that's the core of the difference. It's just like what I want out of the brewing process. I mean, for me, it's just about finding out the truth about cards, right? You mentioned Arena deck list. They talk about what is the truth about the format, what's the best deck. And maybe for Aspiring Spike, it's, what is the best way that I can attack the current metagame using tools that seem like they're well positioned right now. And for me, like partly just because of what I like, and partly it fits my goals as a content creator, is to just sort of focus on the card itself. Whether it's well positioned or not is something that I hope to discover, doing my best to make it competitive.
Do you have ambitions of making those cards or those decks competitively viable, or are you just kind of like ready and willing to kill those darlings and move on if something doesn't work?
Well, I think, every brewer has some dream in the back of their mind that they're going to break it someday and just come up with this brilliant deck no one's thought of and win the Pro Tour. But then it's like, if that actually came true, if a genie granted that wish, you realize you actually just can't do it, right? You can't actually have a secret deck that no one has seen before the Pro Tour. Because if it actually is good, as soon as the word gets out there, everyone's going to start playing it. Yeah. It'll become the villain. So you just have to sort of, once you realize that, then you realize that, what is your goal, like, for you personally, right? And I'm not talking about, what is the MPL player's goal? Just like as a player, as someone who's like likes thinking about brainstorming ideas, like what do I want out of it? I just want to sort of feel like I made some progress and discovered some things, even if it's just like, oh, that interaction worked out pretty well, even though the deck failed miserably. Maybe I'll just keep that in my back pocket. And then, 5 weeks later, I see a better player than me, incorporates the same interaction in their deck. Maybe they didn't get it from me, but it's just sort of like, yeah, all right, that was nice. Like I felt like I learned something. I enjoyed just the experience of discovering that one thing. And then, seeing it play out in some way in the real world among sort of the more cutthroat metagame. All that being said, the competitiveness of brewing, there's just an inherent tension of that. You guys talk about casual spike as something that has a fundamental contradiction. I use the phrase spike rogue, which is also a contradiction. You're talking about, we want to be competitive, but we also want to be off meta. You can't really have it both ways. You have to sort of set the goalpost yourself on a card-to-card, deck-to-deck basis.
So something I heard on Pro Points once upon a time was kind of just like a brief aside that Mike Segrist made that I had been obsessed over like ever since, where he said that the best thing you can have going into a game of Magic is a deck advantage.
Yes. I think about that a lot.
We think about that a lot on the show. And really, I wanted to ask you as a brewer how you think about that and maybe what your thoughts are on having a deck advantage versus a skill advantage. And specifically, like, do you think playing a deck that you're very experienced with is more valuable than approaching maybe a tournament with a very novel deck that opponents might not be expecting that you're trying to surprise them with?
So if the goal is to win the match or the tournament, you should definitely go with the deck you're experienced with and that you've been practicing for a while, that you've been studying. So the Mike Segrist approach. But you mentioned Pro Points. He has a co-host on that with Sam Black, who is one of the most famous Hall of Fame caliber brewers. And he's actually someone that is a sort of inspiration to me in terms of like how he approaches the deck building process. He talks about just the discovery process. He wants to try to take a card and help that card sort of become its best self. So he'll push as far as he can. He'll try to think through a card from beginning to end, top to bottom, and try to figure out what does this card need to be surrounded with to make it tick and build the best version of a deck around that card that he can. Maybe he'll even play that in tournaments. And then maybe at the end result of all that process is that it's just a worse version of a meta deck. And that's fine. That's an acceptable outcome. So in that sense, there's no right or wrong answer to that. I think that everything that Mike Sigris said about, yeah, you can have a deck edge or a skill edge if the goal is to win. For me, that's just one of the goals. That's a nice bonus, but I don't think about that too much. I lose a lot all the time.
Same.
Yeah, I mean, it's like, what are your goals as a player, Stan or Shane?
Shane, you go first. I want to hear your goals.
That's a really good question right now. It's like I haven't thought about that for a minute, honestly. Like, what are my goals as a player? And I think my primary goal as a player is to feel like I am winning and I know why I'm winning. Like, so that's kind of like, that's sort of a spiky mentality, right? Like, it's like, I think most people who play do want to win the game. It feels good, tickles the serotonin receptors and the dendrites up in your skull, makes you feel good. But like, I think more importantly is a lot of times is knowing how you played in a way that navigated you to that win feels really good and feels really satisfying. And I like opportunities for games that allow me to do that. And then I have goals related to sort of the meta dash game of Magic, right? Which is engaging with the community, engaging with my friends. Doing the podcast is a Magic related goal and enjoyment that's not gameplay related hardly at all. And that's just sort of a different way to engage with the game on the whole. But in terms of gameplay, I think that's kind of, what I said earlier.
I think my goal is when I identify that there's a new deck that I like to play and then start to recognize that I'm getting better with it. That's usually the dragon I'm chasing. Like, I want to feel like I can identify my level up moments whenever I pick up a new strategy and commit to like focusing on that strategy for an extended period of time. Because that's really hard to do. I think even that first part is really hard to do, to find like that deck that you enjoy, especially like in a game of Magic where there's like endless possibilities and strategies and configurations. Like last week I discovered that tap out control was a thing. Never knew that. But like knowing that my hard work pays off and kind of being able to point to like, wow, this is kind of what Shane said. Like, this is the decision I made because I know enough about this deck and this matchup that like I wouldn't have made this unless I put the time into it. Seeing those moments is really rewarding for me. I still sometimes lose, but knowing that I made a good decision along the way to that loss is still okay.
I mean, I think those are great goals, and that's the only message. It's weird that it's weird to think this as a brewing message, but setting your own goalpost and knowing what you want out of, the whole process of playing Magic is like the number one thing I want to convey to people who are just thinking about, how do I brew? Can I brew? Like, yeah, be prepared to lose and just be prepared to think about, okay, that's okay. Like, what did I take away from this? I think you'll find that it's actually really rewarding, just the process of searching for cards. Scryfall is your very best friend. I've gotten quite good at Scryfall searches. Looking for weird turns of phrase and Oracle text. You just get to know different sides of the game. Even saying that, this is a podcast about Modern or Pioneer, what do those words mean to people? Is Modern just the tier 1 metagame? Is Pioneer just, the archetypes that are winning tournaments? Or is it more than that? I mean, is it the entire card pool and all the potential strategies that are waiting to be discovered? It's okay to like sort of switch between those roles. I mean, I play tier decks all the time just for fun. I also brew. You can do both.
What tier decks do you like to play?
Well, I guess if I answer this question honestly, you'll discover that they're not really tier decks. I'm a big fan of Serum Powder Eldrazi. That one's been a casualty of the last year.
Yeah.
I like Jund. I'm going to call Niv Mizzet a tier deck. That's my all-time favorite deck.
Oh, yeah, of course. 2. Of course. What about in Pioneer?
In Pioneer, I do not have a tier deck that I can call my own at this time. But I'm looking for one. Open suggestions.
All right. When you find out,
just hoping
we'll have you back. All right. So we got a ton of great questions from the community ahead of this episode, and I'd love to give some time back to the people who submitted those questions to us and to you, Dan. So how about we take a really quick break, take a breather, a sip of water, and when we return, we can wind down with another Q&A, but this time with questions from the Dive Down Nation. Stay with us.
right, we're back again. And as Stan mentioned, we'll use the wind down to ask some listener questions from the Dive Down Nation for Cavedan of Faithless Brewing again. So the first question we have from Electrolyze. I like this question because it lets you talk about one of your newest content creation avenues. How has producing content for Wizards changed how you brew? Are you less likely to go all out when Paul Cheon is going to be judging you? So what is Electrolyze talking about, Dan, if people don't know?
Yeah, you mentioned that I'm a famous YouTuber, and I'm just trying that phrase out for the first time right now. That sounds ridiculous to me. But I am now doing a little bit of video content together with my colleagues at Faithless Brewing, Damon and David. So the three of us have joined the cast of a new show. It's a video show. It's called Rogue Refinery. And this is actually part of a series of shows. Wizards of the Coast is actually trying to put out some new VODs. So they're all hosted on the main Magic the Gathering YouTube channel. So there's a show called The Advantage Bar with Maria Bartoldi, Riley Knight, Cedric Phillips, Corey Baumeister, Corbin Hustler. You know, the real famous celebrities. They're talking about Standard all the time. I think Marshall Sutcliffe has a show on Limited. Rich Hagan has a show interviewing MPL players. And then there's also, amidst all that, a deck building show, a show in which we pick a card of the week and sort of like put it through its paces, not just on Standard, but also in Modern and Pioneer. So that's called Rogue Refinery. That's hosted by Paul Cheon and Ailey Loney. And it has the three of us from Faithless Brewing on there as well. We're putting together decks, we're playing them, we're talking about them, and you can even see gameplay from our testing leagues.
That's awesome. Has it impacted how you brew at all? Or are you able to just do whatever you want?
Well, so the thing about Paul Cheon is he's an old school gamer. He's worn so many hats. And what I'm discovering is that he is very, very nostalgic for the old spicy decks he used to play back in his playing and streaming career. So he's very excited to see whatever we come up with in Modern and especially Pioneer. For Rogue Refinery, I've been playing in the Standard seat. So the cards, I think SEC is like what I do with the card. He's thinking of his time on play design or whatever as a commentator of Mythic Championships, that sort of thing. So I'm not sure if he enjoys those decks as much, but it's interesting to see, like, you learn a lot about people that way. He loves this place.
Yeah. I was really excited to see Rogue Refinery get launched just because I know it's the product of a lot of hard work from you and your co-hosts, and I think it's always awesome to see like Wizards recognize like some of the really positive, hardworking members of the community that can really contribute to the players who are looking for new ways to engage with the game. So I tip my hat.
Yeah, so I definitely recommend. I know that, not everyone who listens to podcasts has time to sit down and watch a video. I certainly don't watch a ton of videos, but it's kind of a new experiment from Wizards to just offer video on demand content. So check out the whole lineup. And if you enjoy like seeing content in Pioneer and Modern, we even show Magic Online gameplay, let them know, because it's all very experimental. So we're definitely interested in your feedback, and yeah, hope you check it out.
Right on. So we have a question from Jason that I really like because A, it's super timely, and B, I think this is a player that you've talked about on Faithless Brewing. This is Kilgore Trout on MTGO, a brewer and a very active member in the Dive Down Nation, who asks, assuming the companion mechanic is significantly nerfed, we're basically entering an open meta now. How do you approach brewing in such a metagame? And do you do anything different than in perhaps a more solved metagame?
So I don't do anything different, but I'm interested to hear what you guys would answer this question as well.
I mean, I usually just wait until like the very first Modern or Pioneer challenge and the 5-0 deck dump and like pick a deck that's like, oh, this looks like what I've been playing. I like that this is kind of addressing the changes. I'm going to see if this works and kind of take it from there. I'm very reactive in that regard. Like I'm a filthy net decker and proud of it.
Oh yeah. I'm not the brewer at all. So I mean, like my response is like, can I play mono green planeswalkers again? Can I play like my favorite deck sort of back? Like how am I have to tweak it? Like that's what I'm hoping for.
Yeah, there's always a part of that for me. Like if I see a new spin on Blue Moon, there is an increased chance that I will try that just because like that's a deck that kind of comes and goes. It's always somewhere between tier 3 and tier 2.5. And like maybe when I can get some action in that tier 2.5 range, that's an exciting time.
You guys can only say that you're not brewers so many times before I have to call you out on it, because it's just not true. It's just not true. The evidence is there in your past episodes. You brewed some spicy numbers, and I hope this is not giving away too many Dive Down Nation secrets, but in the Slack channel, there is a wonderful channel called the Brew Down with tons of players who, they're interested in what you have to say about the tier 1 decks, and they also just they love trying out their own crazy brews. So it doesn't have to be an either or thing. It's okay to be both at the same time.
That's true. Thank you for keeping us honest.
I like a question that Sid asks. What are components of cards that make them brew worthy, in your opinion? Like, is it like a gut feeling? Are there like criteria you're looking for? Like, what makes you want to brew around a card?
Yeah, so for me personally, it's a card that has a very high ceiling and also a very specific ask that I think can be solved in interesting ways. So if I feel like there's a puzzle that I can solve in an unexpected way, then I'm very interested in the card. Sometimes that means that, like I alluded to, if a puzzle gets solved too quickly, it's just not interesting anymore. So sometimes there'll be a card where like, oh, I think I know what I want to do with that, but if everyone else has already figured it out, I just sort of lose interest. And that's not the spiky answer. That's just, for me personally, it ceases to be interesting if I don't feel there's a cleverness to it that I find rewarding and just keeps me engaged with that process. So it's a bit of a silly answer, but it is what it is.
I really like this question from Odin because it's a concept that I know, like, I've talked about with friends, whether or not it's even possible. It's a very recurring theme in Magic communities in general. And he asks, what do you think the odds are of a brand new deck emerging in Modern? Are there any unexplored avenues left considering the vast card pool?
The odds of a brand new deck emerging in Modern.
And I kind of think that Odin here means without any new cards being printed. Like, is there maybe some untapped tier 1 synergy that just no one's identified yet?
I would put the odds at 94.7%, plus or minus 3%. What do you guys think?
Well, it's one of those things where someone like Aspiring Spike, I mean, this is not to put down your all brewing chops, but like what's Spike consistently will bring a new deck that sticks around. Like not always. I mean, you all have done this too with Niv, of course, right? And probably other things I'm not even thinking of. But Mono Green Walkers is a deck that I've talked a lot about, and it's a deck that I don't think he created it from the ground up, but I know that he refined it and changed a lot of cards and showcased it, and then it stuck until Companions, of course. Like, it was a thing. It was a tier 1 deck that was always showing up, and it was a tier 1. And that's something that, it's Pioneer. It's not Modern. It's a more nascent format rather, and Modern is a little bit more established. But there's the card pool and depth of the game, and we've seen Spike do this and other streamers do this, is they'll figure out either interactions that are unexplored or responses to a metagame that are currently unexplored and make something new and good that becomes a real deck, or people refine it to become a real deck. The community is really good at doing that.
And the metagame changes constantly. Everything is contextual. So as you guys talk about in great detail, right? The metagame is always changing. So one of the advantages that you would have had if you spent a lot of time sort of pouring through the sort of cards on the fringes of a format is that you just sort of have a back catalog, a little notebook of failed ideas that didn't quite work out, the timing wasn't right, but at some point maybe the stars align and actually counterbalance is very good in Modern, and that's what I think Everett was able to do. So it's not simply a matter of just brewing for the sake of science. I think there are real competitive edges to be gained if your goal is to sort of be a pace setter in the metagame.
All right, this is the last one. It's barely a question. It's kind of just a thought. Please brew with Nahiri, the Harbinger, in Pioneer. That's from Trevor. I wanted you to hear him.
In Pioneer specifically.
Yeah.
Okay. I'll see what I can do. I had a sweet deck for Nahiri in Modern. It was a Luca Emrakul deck that also incorporated the Saheeli Faladar Guardian combo. This is something that David, my co-host, was promoting heavily, and the trick there being that Faladar Guardian, if you hit it off the Luca -2 can actually just blink the Luca to continue up the chain immediately up to Emrakul. So it kind of like broke the bargain. And that's what I mean by a clever solution to something. So Luca, if you're looking at it and saying, okay, the bargain here is that as long as I play all 1-mana creatures, I can have, a polymorph deck that also includes mana dorks. That's pretty cool. And presumably, that's a fair exchange. But what if you can sort of cheat on that by playing a 4-mana creature as well that still lets you give the option to go up to Emrakul? Something like that is what really excites me as a brewer. Like, oh yeah, like that was an interesting workaround for what I thought, what the plain usage of a card was. That deck has some Nahiris in it, so I'll see if there's a Pioneer version that can make work.
All right. Dan's on the case.
Yeah, so thanks for that question. And while we're on the Q&A beat, I do want to just like take a minute to ask you guys a question, if I may be so bold.
Bring it on.
So
Be bold.
Yeah, so I've been listening to your podcast since the beginning. And I guess the question that I have as a sort of fellow podcaster or content creator is sort of what would you say is your secret ingredient at the Dive Down?
Shane is the secret ingredient.
No, we've talked about this and thought about it, and like people have asked us who are like we're starting up pods or something like that. They kind of like give us some advice, and I think the advice is work with people you like working with and prepare. Like we prepare an awful lot. People who see our show notes understand this at this point. We write a lot. We think a lot about every episode before we go into it. And I think we have not necessarily our own interests in mind, but the interests of what we have defined as the listeners and what we know the listeners have wanted from us in the past. And it's to keep learning and to keep getting better at Magic and to not focus on negativity and not focus on the meta game of WotC and of maybe community drama and things like that. I think that we try to stay positive and try to be positive about getting better at Magic and enjoying the game. That's what I think it is. And then preparing based on that, with that in mind.
Yeah, I think that's true. I mean, I wasn't joking. Like Shane does a really good job of like keeping me to task, I think. And like Shane, I think you've done a nice job as a producer, and I have a hard time imagining being able to make this show without you.
Well, thank you, Stan. I think, well, it's definitely a collective effort. I think we're now on autopilot. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
I think there was some of the things that like early on it was learning how to do it, right? And I think that there was some that required maybe like I definitely wanted to get this thing started and get rolling with it and get it off the ground. And I think we collaborated on what that would be and what format it would take and what we wanted to talk about and the content in it. And then we're now to the point now where we work with each other so well and we are so aligned on what the podcast is and what we want to talk about that it's no one person's. And I think that is the best part about it.
Yeah, I mean, it's like the 10,000 hour rule almost. We haven't done 10,000 hours, but we're very practiced. And I think one of the hardest things for me at first was finding not just our voice, but even my voice in that and like figuring out what my strengths were as a podcast producer and contributor. And once I started hearing the episodes that I loved listening to, even though I made them, and like trying to like build upon the things that I find interesting that I know the community responds to, it was just kind of a matter of like innovating on that, finding like the restrictions within which we can experiment, but also like knowing what works well and not necessarily trying to fix something that isn't broken. So it's hard work. I mean, surely you would agree.
But the work that you guys put into it really shows, and I suspect that you're not as far from the 10,000 hour mark as you might think. I mean, it's not just, okay, there's 70 episodes of Dive Down times 1.5 hours. The amount of hours of prep that goes into, preparing for a show, putting it out there afterwards, everything involved, the administrative side of it. I mean, you guys are the gold standard for podcasts for a reason, for me personally, and I'm just, it's an honor and a privilege to be invited for the second time to come chat with you guys. So thank you so much.
Dan, I do not take compliments well, so shut up.
Dan, thanks for coming on. We really enjoy doing this with you. It's always an awesome opportunity to do this with other people in the community. So thanks for substituting for Dave. Oh yeah, we didn't even mention where Dave is. You know, Dave's off this week. He's enjoying some family time.
Who's Dave? have I not always been the host of the Dive Down? Are we not full of retconning this? You can splice me back into all the previous episodes.
Dave is no longer canon. All right, that wraps up this week's show. Dan, thanks again so much. This was fun. This is my first time chatting with you vocally and not via chat, and it was fun. Maybe we can do it again sometime.
Always a pleasure. I look forward to it. Thank you so much.
All right, before we really wrap up, Dan, where can people find you? Where can people find your podcast? Where can people find your YouTube channel?
Yeah, so our podcast is called Faithless Brewing. You can find that on all the major places where you get your podcasts. If you're listening in your podcast player right now, we're probably there as well. Rogue Refinery is our new project. As I mentioned, that is on YouTube. So just go to YouTube, type in Rogue Refinery. I actually don't know the URL, but it's under the Magic the Gathering umbrella. So those are the two main places. If you want to come hang out with me more often, I'm on Twitter at FaithlessMTG. We also have a Discord channel for our patrons. It's patreon.com/faithlessbrewing. If you just want to hear us talk about brewing, just want to chop it up a little bit more and workshop some deck ideas, we'd love to chat with you there as well.
All right. Faithless Brewing and Rogue Refinery get the official Dive Down stamp of approval. But that wraps up this week's show. If you haven't yet, make sure you subscribe to both of our podcasts so you get the latest episodes as soon as they come out. And if you use Apple Podcasts, please leave both of our podcasts a friendly rating and review. If you'd like to submit a question to our show or pick our brain on something in modern and pioneer, you can tweet us at The Dive Down, all one word, or email thedivedown@gmail.com. If you'd like to support the show, you can join our Patreon, where joining at any tier gets you access to our super secret Slack channel. Find that over at patreon.com/thedivedown. Also, shout out to Mana Traders for sponsoring the Dive Down. You can sign up for Mana Traders using promo code TheDiveDown, all one word, and get 15% off your first 3 months of renting Magic Online cards. As always, special thanks to the bands Nowhere and Spaceblood for letting us use their music. And until next week, get out there and brew more Down!
You want me to lead the dive down portion, Stan? Because you did breakdown.
Sure, if you'd like to. I wrote a very nice script here that
I saw that. The script looks good. I'll riff on it.
So be my guest.
Select all delete.